World of Warfare presents Bombing Axis Oil. Just after the end of World War I, French diplomat Victor H. Beranger wrote, "He who owns the oil will own the world, for he will rule the sea by means of the heavy oils, and the air by means of the ultra-refined oils, and the land by means of petrol and the illuminating oils. And in addition to these, he will rule his fellow man in an economic sense by reason of the fantastic wealth he will derive from oil." Beginning in May 1944, the Allies' focus on bombing Axis oil refineries began to show dramatic results in the war against Nazi aggression. Albert Speer, the Reich's recently appointed Minister of Armaments and War Production, later wrote that beginning in May of 1944, the Allied bombing of Axis oil facilities comprised the first heavy blow against Germany's ability to keep planes in the air and mechanized units on the battlefield. Given the importance of petroleum fuels and lubricants in modern warfare, Germany began the war well out of step with the Allies in terms of the 20th century's rapid conversion from coal to oil. By 1939, oil accounted for half of the United States' energy needs, while in Germany, coal continued to account for 90% of her fuel source. Additionally, the Allies controlled 90% of the world's oil production, while Axis nations controlled an anemic 3%. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, German reserves of aviation and motor fuels were no more than a 2 to 3 month supply, obliging the Nazis to import 70% of its fuel from abroad. Hitler's initial reliance on blitzkrieg invasion tactics, however, soon allowed the Reich to quickly commandeer rich oil fields and refineries in Hungary, Austria, and Romania. The 10 refineries surrounding Ploesti, for example, provided upwards of 60% of Germany's petroleum needs throughout the early years of the war. Germany further offset her pre-war petroleum shortfalls by mastering a technique of converting coal into synthetic petroleum products, including gasoline and high-octane aviation fuel. German companies such as IG Farben began building plants in occupied countries, employing slave labor to man upwards of 30% of each plant's labor requirements. By early 1944, synthetic oil accounted for nearly half of Germany's total fuel requirements. Combined with an all-time record output in fighter production, the Luftwaffe remained a viable threat scant months before the planned Allied invasion of northern France. In addition to the threats posed by German fuel and aircraft production, by May of 1944, Allied airmen had witnessed the first jet fighter to menace the skies over Europe. Although short on legs, the Messerschmitt Me-262 could stay aloft barely an hour before exhausting its fuel supply. The twin-turbo jet possessed a top speed of 540 miles per hour, making it roughly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. To make matters worse, the plane ran on diesel, which Germany could produce in far greater abundance than traditional high-octane aviation fuel used by most other combustion-engine German and Axis fighters. Air leaders worried that if Germany could mass-produce the Me-262, then the Germans could regain a position of air superiority over European skies. America's own efforts at producing a viable jet fighter, the Bell P-59, proved to be no faster than the Mustang. Only in hindsight would historians and Air Force leaders comprehend how Hitler's own madness had delayed the production of the Me-262 as an integral fighter asset for the Luftwaffe. Against the opinion of his advisors, Hitler insisted that the Me-262 be converted from a fighter to a fighter bomber, or blitz bomber, as he so named his vision for the jet. Hitler saw the Me-262 as a useful reprisal weapon against English cities, strutting the notion that terror is only broken by terror. Erhard Milch, then the Reich's Minister of Armaments and War Production, defied Hitler's orders, keeping the jet's development path focused as a fighter rather than a fighter-bomber. When the first Me-262s rolled off the production lines in May of 1944, an enraged Hitler removed Milch from office, replacing him with Albert Speer. Despite the Me-262's speed advantage, Allied airmen quickly discovered the jet's Achilles heel. Besides her limited flight time, the Me-262 was precariously sluggish on takeoff and landing, prompting Allied reconnaissance pilots to focus their coordination with Allied fighter pilots, choreographing attacks on the jet during its most vulnerable moments of flight. Chuck Yeager's sole victory against an Me-262 occurred in this exact manner, when he successfully bounced a 262 coming in for a landing. "I dove at him," Yeager recalled. His landing gear was down, and he was lining up the runway, coming in at no more than 200 miles an hour, when I dropped on his ass at 500. Yeager fired on the defenseless aircraft, which crashed and exploded just short of the runway. Meanwhile, the 8th, 9th, and 15th Airmen continued to bring the fight against Axis targets of strategic importance, with an ever-increasing emphasis on Axis oil. On May the 5th, General Carl Toohey Spaatz, head of the 8th Air Force, issued his first maximum effort raid on oil refineries near Ploesti, putting up 485 heavy bombers to the task. The bomber stream unleashed 1,220 tons of bombs on marshalling yards and refineries, while experiencing intense and accurate flak that had nearly doubled in volume since the month before. Approaching peak strength now, the 15th lost 18 heavies on the mission, which, despite the tragically high number, still equated to a sustainable 4% attrition rate. The Luftwaffe lost 28 fighters during the raid, while the refineries below suffered such damage as to severely limit Germany's oil refining capacity for months to come. During the raid, airmen witnessed the Germans' use of captured Allied planes known as Thistles, flown near the bomber stream in an effort to radio course, speed, and altitude to the flak gunners below. Thistles generally veered away from the bomber stream before gunners could fire any retaliatory shots. On May 7, 1944, Leroy Beck of the 454th Bomb Group lost power in his Liberator's engines while approaching the target near Bucharest, Romania. Beck struggled to keep his bomber in formation until flak permanently shut down two of his faltering engines. Losing altitude, Beck ordered his crew to lighten the ship by dumping guns and ammunition, flak suits, and even the radio. Limping for home over Yugoslavia, the crew's situation worsened when two Me-109s bounced the Liberator, wounding 6 crew members while further crippling the already battered ship. Tail gunner Samuel Grieco returned fire with the only machine gun still remaining in the rear of the plane, but was soon wounded himself by enemy fire. With 2 crew members dead and 4 injured, conditions worsened again when fire broke out in the auxiliary bomb bay fuel tanks, forcing Beck to issue the bailout order. 6 crew members made it out before the bomber spun out of control and exploded. Last seen climbing out of his battle station, nose turret gunner John Warnock was later found in the downed plane, along with Beck, who had stayed with his ship long enough for his crewmates to make a successful bailout. The body of Beck's co-pilot was later found dead on the ground, the result of insufficient altitude by the time he opened his parachute. Eyewitnesses on the ground found a ripcord still clutched in the dead aviator's hand. Harry Boyer was also killed, his parachute riddled with bullet holes and only partially open when his body struck the ground. West was taken prisoner after a successful parachute drop, while Samuel Grieco, Thomas Muirhead, and navigator Thomas Kerrigan landed safely in Chetnik territory. Lacking proper medical care and supplies, Grieco later died from his injuries. Through the aid of partisan resistance fighters, Kerrigan and Muirhead made it back to Italy by early July. On May 14, 1944, on what intelligence experts described to 451st Bomb Group Airmen as a milk run, William Booker's Liberators suffered a direct hit by flak, wounding Booker in the leg while filling the cockpit with acrid smoke. Handing over control to co-pilot Charles Brown, the crew successfully dropped their payload before turning the crippled plane for home. While crew members tended to the injuries suffered by the pilot and the nose gunner, the engineer reported that the hydraulics and radio were knocked out, along with considerable damage to the landing gear. The nose wheel and left main landing gear tires flattened. To land the plane, the crew would need to manually crank down the landing gear and flaps, but with 2 tires blown, the plane had the potential to swerve off the runway and crash. One of the crew read somewhere about a similar situation, Brown recounted later, where parachutes were opened via the waist windows just before touchdown. We decided to try it. We attached the chutes to the waist gun mounts. Brown made a low-altitude flyby at first, firing off red flares to notify ground personnel that they had injured aboard the crippled Liberator. Lining up with the crash strip, so as not to block the main runway should they land sloppy, Brown's engineer, Arthur Brewer, sat in the left seat and called out their airspeed as the plane came in hot. I dragged the airplane in on the landing approach, Brown recollected. We made what I thought was a pretty good power-on, nose-high landing on the right wheel. When the plane touched and slowed, the left wheel came down and we veered to the left on the strip. Upon impact, the nose wheel collapsed and we skidded to a stop with the nose telescoping up toward the flight deck. I can remember watching the nose section coming up and hoping that the plane would stop before our legs were crushed by the instrument panel. After an eternity, we stopped. On May 27, 1944, the 459th Bomb Group left Italy for a raid on Montpellier, France. Along for the flight was the crew of Delayed Action, flying their first mission since arriving from the States. Nearing the French coastline, Delayed Action's No. 3 engine lost oil pressure, forcing pilot Ken Harrison to shut down the engine and feather the prop. After radioing flight lead about their situation, the flight leader suggested that Delayed Action return to base with their complement of bombs. From that point on, recounts waist gunner Howard Haig, things just seemed to keep going wrong for us. On the return flight home, they encountered heavy inaccurate flak over the island of Elba, prompting Harrison to drop his payload on the enemy. A piece of flak hit our co-pilot, Norm Krause, Haig continued, and broke one of his legs very badly. Our navigator, Charles Adams, got in the co-pilot's seat after Krause was moved to the radio compartment on the flight deck. Our bombardier, Norm Apperson, and our radio operator, Jimmy Hines, were working on Krause's leg. We got out of there as soon as we could and headed down the coast of Italy in the general direction of Naples. Flak had shot out the No. 2 engine, causing a fire that would not extinguish itself even after Harrison feathered the prop and toggled the engine's fire extinguisher. The Liberator now flew on her 2 outboard engines. In an attempt to identify the closest place to land, the radio operator contacted forward Allied units at the Anzio beachhead, who indicated they had a medical evacuation landing strip that Delayed Action could use in a pinch. On approach to the landing strip, Harrison asked Haig to physically check that all 3 landing struts were down and locked. And once Haig returned to the flight deck with a thumbs up, Harrison dropped down for a final approach into the Anzio beachhead. Descending toward the strip, the plane skipped off a mountain rise and split apart between the waist and the bomb bay, setting the wreckage ablaze. Haig had joined 3 other crewmen in the waist before the crash, and they, by necessity, had to cut their way out of the plane. Once free, they realized they had crashed at Anzio's front line. British infantrymen were yelling orders to one another, quickly moving the injured airmen into nearby foxholes, all the while continuing an ongoing exchange of fire with German forces. We were stunned by the violence of the crash and the speed with which these events were taking place, Haig recalled, not to mention what had already happened that morning. I guess we thought that other than some cuts, bumps, bruises, broken bones, and maybe some burns, everybody was getting out of the airplane at different places with the help of the British infantry. Sadly, our assessment of the situation was wrong. Co-pilot Norm Krause, Bombardier Norm Apperson, and radio operator Jimmy Hines were killed in the crash, while navigator Charles Adams, engineer Bob Widdop, and Harrison were seriously injured. The injured were later airlifted back to the States for medical treatment, each involving long hospital stays. Spatz's maximum effort order against Axis Oil, unleashed during the first 5 months of 1944, cost the 8th and 15th Air Forces dearly in men and machines, losing a staggering 2,351 heavy bombers to combat. Another 254 were lost to accidents or unrepairable battle damage. The 8th and 9th Air Forces lost 983 fighters, while suffering 18,403 casualties, 5,427 killed in action, 11,033 missing in action or interned in Axis prison camps, along with 1,943 wounded. The 15th and 12th Air Forces lost 595 fighters, sustaining 7,285 casualties, 2,780 killed in action, 3,452 missing in action, and 1,053 wounded. Nearly 80% of these losses were suffered by the 15th.